Yorkshire, 1841. The rain fell in thin silver threads, as if the sky itself were mourning everything Victoria Lennox had left behind. Inside the carriage, the steady rocking blended with the rhythmic clatter of horseshoes against the muddy road, a grim tempo marking the beat of her escape. She clutched a small leather case against her chest, tight enough to feel her own heart pounding. Quick, uneven, almost guilty. Inside that case lay the last fragile remains of her old life. 3 dark dresses, a worn brooch bearing her mother's faded portrait, and a forged letter of recommendation signed by an imaginary countess. She didn't look back. She couldn't. London was behind her, along with the golden ballrooms where she had learned to smile in silence, the so-called friends who vanished the moment ruin whispered her name, and, above all, the cold voice of her brother echoing in her head. "You will marry Bancroft, or you'll drag our mother's name down with mine." Lord Henry Lennox, her brother, her warden. The Earl of Bancroft was 65, with 3 dead wives and eyes that saw women as possessions. Victoria was 24, and possessed a soul that would rather starve than surrender. That was why she had fled, why she had remade herself entirely. She was Miss Clara Winters now, a modest governess engaged to instruct the Duke of Warrington's children. The advertisement in the paper had promised a handsome salary, far too generous for a young woman without connections. But more than that, it had mentioned an isolated estate deep in the Yorkshire countryside, far from London, far from anyone who might recognize her. The perfect place to vanish, and perhaps for the first time, to begin again. The carriage finally stopped. The driver climbed down, opened the door, and a rush of cold wind swept in, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. Before her stood Warrington Hall, vast, shadowed, and ancient, its ivy-covered walls weeping under the drizzle. The gardens were abandoned, the rose bushes long dead from winter's cruelty. It was the kind of place where joy died quietly. Victoria stepped down, the rain tracing icy lines along her neck. When she lifted her gaze, she saw a light in one of the upper windows, and behind the glass, the face of a little girl. Wide eyes, brown curls, a lost expression. The child raised her hand, pressing her palm against the windowpane as if reaching for someone who never came. Victoria's chest tightened. Perhaps, she thought, I've come to the right place. Here, no one knew her name. Here she might finally breathe without judgment. She lifted her chin, straightened her soaked shawl, and stepped toward the gates. But a voice inside, older than fear itself, whispered, "Hiding is easy. Surviving the gaze of a man who sees too much, that will be harder." The butler received her with the solemnity of a man long accustomed to serving ghosts. They crossed endless corridors paneled in dark wood, lined with portraits of long-dead dukes and duchesses, eyes frozen, eternal witnesses who refused to fade. The air smelled faintly of melted wax and old sorrow. Every footstep echoed, as if the house itself were weighing her worth. "The Duke will see you shortly," the butler said, opening the door to a vast drawing room. The fire in the hearth burned weakly, more ember than flame. In the corner, a piano lay under a white cloth, like a tomb for forgotten music. Victoria was left alone. She adjusted her plain dress and watched the shadows waver across the walls. Everything in that house carried the stillness of mourning. It was too alive to be dead, and too dead to be alive. Then, footsteps. Firm, deliberate, echoing through the corridor. Victoria straightened instinctively, then remembered. Governesses did not stand like countesses. She relaxed her shoulders, inhaled deeply, and hid her trembling hands in the folds of her skirt. The door opened. He entered, tall, commanding. The kind of presence that made the air itself yield. Broad shoulders beneath a black coat, a face carved by weariness, and by something older than grief. His dark hair was neatly combed, his features sharp, his bearing precise. But his eyes, God, those eyes, held the frozen blue of winter mornings when the sun seems too tired to rise. Alexander Hargrave, Duke of Warrington, widower, a man who wore his mourning as armor and his silence as penance. Miss Winters, I presume, he said, his voice low and steady, every syllable perfectly measured to conceal fatigue. Victoria curtsied, far too gracefully. A reflex from a life she had sworn to bury. He paused, studying her. For a moment something flickered in his gaze. Curiosity, or suspicion. Victoria rose quickly. Yes, Your Grace. He nodded slowly. The children require discipline. And consistency. The last governess left 3 weeks ago. I expect you'll prove more resilient. She met his eyes. I am, Your Grace. He looked her over, not with interest, but as one might assess a piece of furniture. And yet, for the briefest moment, his gaze faltered. Something unspoken passed between them. A quiet recognition, 2 faces marked by secrets. 2 souls who, without knowing it, had already begun to see each other. Before we continue this story, please support our work by subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next tales of love and scandal. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching? I love seeing where in the world our stories travel. Now, continue this beautiful story of Victoria and Alexander. Chapter 1. The Children's Wing. The Children's Wing occupied the far end of the 2nd floor of Hargrave Manor, a corridor so long it seemed to stretch back into time itself. The walls, lined with portraits of stern ancestors and heavy embroidered curtains, held the chill of a place where joy had died too young. Every step Victoria took echoed like an unwelcome sound, an intrusion, almost profane, in a silence that wasn't merely the absence of noise, but a deliberate choice. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, walked ahead of her. A pale woman in middle age with deep-set eyes, the kind who had learned to survive by being invisible. With every creak of the stairs, her voice carried the weary rhythm of years spent in obedience. The children don't leave their rooms much, she said without turning. Since her Grace passed, His Grace prefers it that way. Order, silence. Victoria frowned. Children need air, movement, light. Mrs. Dawson stopped, turned slowly, and for a moment her tired eyes seemed to awaken, not from hope, but from memory. The last governess said the same, she replied, not as a warning, but as a fact long resigned. She lasted 2 weeks. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Victoria only nodded. The fear was real, but something stronger pulsed beneath it, the need to prove to herself that she could still do good, even while hiding who she truly was. Mrs. Dawson opened a door. The young master and miss are inside. The nursery was large and elegant, yet terribly cold. Heavy curtains allowed only a sliver of gray light to enter, turning the toys into shadows. Everything was too tidy, too perfect. A wooden horse stood precisely aligned with the carpet. A porcelain doll stared blankly from her chair. Piles of books sat untouched, their spines unbent. It was not a room for children, but a room about them, preserved, like a memory no one dared disturb. And there they were. Thomas, the 7-year-old heir, already carried the weight of his title in his small, tense shoulders. Dark hair, blue eyes. His father's reflection in miniature. He wore a waistcoat and tie, clothes too serious for a child. Sophie, 5 years old, still had shards of innocence glimmering behind her quiet gaze. Brown curls, a faded blue ribbon, and a white dress that belonged more to a doll than a little girl. Neither of them smiled. Victoria entered softly, closing the door as one might enter a sanctuary. She knelt, a natural, instinctive gesture, until her eyes were level with theirs. "Hello," she said gently. "My name is Miss Winters. I've come to teach you." Thomas said nothing. He watched her with that same distant, measured calm she would later recognize in the Duke himself. But Sophie blinked, curious, shy. "The other lady left," she whispered, in the tone of someone who doesn't yet understand abandonment. "She said we were difficult." Victoria's heart tightened. She smiled, but it was the smile of someone making a promise to endure. Then she wasn't the right person. The right ones don't give up. Thomas lifted his chin, assessing her. You'll leave too. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, born of experience. Victoria met his gaze. The gaze of a boy who had already learned not to expect anything. No, she said softly but firmly. Not unless you ask me to. The stillness that followed was sacred. Sophie broke it first. You talk funny, she said, tilting her head. Victoria tensed. Careful. Do I? How so? Sophie smiled, a small, wistful smile. Like Mama. She talked pretty. Like the words were dancing, Thomas turned sharply to his sister. Don't talk about Mama. His tone cut through the air, sharp, protective, angry. The little girl shrank back, eyes brimming. Before the tears could fall, Victoria reached out, a small, forbidden gesture, and placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. It's all right to talk about her, she said softly. The ones we love don't disappear when we say their names. They come closer. The words lingered, fragile, like something no one had dared speak for a long time. Thomas stared at her, blue eyes bright with a fear too old for his age. Sophie blinked away her tears and, timidly, slid her tiny hand into Victoria's. It was a small hand, warm, trembling, desperate for affection, and in that touch, something inside Victoria cracked. A wall of grief and loneliness she hadn't even known still existed. Later, when Mrs. Dawson came to announce that supper was ready, she found Victoria sitting cross-legged on the floor, a book open in her lap, both children leaning close. Thomas pretended not to listen, but his eyes never left the page. Sophie, wholly entranced, rested her head against Victoria's arm. The housekeeper froze, astonished. Miss Winters? Victoria looked up and smiled. A real smile, the first in that house for a very long time. Just one more chapter, she said softly. Mrs. Dawson hesitated. Then, as if something brittle inside her had softened at last, she nodded. One more, that night. The silence of Hargrave Manor sounded different. Lighter. As though something small, perhaps hope, had slipped in through the cracks. Victoria sat in her attic room beneath the slanted beams, a simple but clean space where the wind made the lamplight flicker. She sat on the edge of her bed and studied her hands that once held lace fans and perfumed letters, now holding the hand of a lost child. Strangely, she didn't feel loss. She felt purpose. Outside her window, one light still burned in the east wing, the Duke's study. Alexander Hargrave, the man who had turned grief into stone and pain into routine. Victoria pressed her forehead to the cold glass. Somewhere behind that window was the man who could ruin everything if he ever learned who she truly was. And yet, for some reason she couldn't explain, she felt the quiet urge to pray for him, not in words, but in a simple wish, that the ice in his heart might someday thaw, just as Sophie's small hand had opened within hers, but a traitorous voice whispered from the dark corner of her mind. And what if he finds out who you really are? Victoria closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she murmured. I'll think about that tomorrow. And outside, as the wind sighed through the moors, the great house of Hargrave breathed, for the first time in 2 long years. Chapter 2. The Crack in the Armor. Alexander Hargrave was not a man of distractions, nor of emotions. His world consisted of hours, ledgers, and silence. Everything about him seemed finely calibrated so that nothing, not even grief, might slip beyond control. Since the death of his wife, he had lived by precision, like clockwork made flesh. He woke at 6, read correspondence at 7, inspected the estate until noon, dined alone at 1, worked until nightfall. No laughter in the halls, no piano music. No fresh flowers in the drawing room. Mourning had turned the house into a mausoleum of memory, and the Duke into its keeper. In the north wing, the portrait of his late wife still hung above the main staircase. Lady Eleanor Hargrave. Young. Beautiful. Forever smiling. The artist had captured in paint what time had erased from his soul. Lightness. Alexander avoided walking beneath that portrait. Yet sometimes when the wind rattled the windows at night, he could swear he heard the rustle of her gown along the corridors. He did not believe in ghosts, and still, on certain sleepless nights, the faint sound of footsteps across the marble floor brought back the scent of her perfume, jasmine and old paper. Those were the memories he kept buried beneath the armor of routine. Each task a wall, each minute a refuge from what hurt too much to face. But that morning, 3 days after Miss Winters's arrival, the armor cracked. It was laughter, soft, uncertain, and impossibly out of place, floating down the corridor like a memory that refused to die. Alexander froze, his hand suspended above the doorknob of his study. The sound came from upstairs, a small, trembling giggle, but unmistakable. Sophie. That laugh, once the sweetest music in the house, had not been heard since the funeral. Before he could stop himself, he climbed the stairs. The boards creaked beneath the weight of hesitation. At the top, he paused. What was he doing? He, who avoided even glancing toward the nursery windows, was now following the sound like a man chasing a forgotten melody. The laughter came again, this time accompanied by a woman's voice. Calm, warm, Miss Winters. He moved toward the half-open door of the schoolroom and looked inside. She was kneeling on the floor, beside Sophie, who held a book in her ink-stained hands. Thomas, the heir, watched them both with a mix of curiosity and cautious relief, his quill suspended midair. Now your turn, Miss Winters said, patient, her tone gentle, almost maternal. Slowly, one syllable at a time. Sophie pronounced the word, stumbled, then tried again. Miss Winters smiled. Perfect. You see? I knew you could. Sophie laughed aloud, bright and pure. Something shifted in Alexander's chest, as though a heavy piece of furniture, long left untouched, had been quietly moved back into place. He stood there, unmoving, simply watching. The woman rose to her feet, and only then did he notice it. Something off, something that didn't belong. That posture. Her movements were too fluid, too assured. Shoulders straight, chin lifted with quiet grace. The bearing of someone accustomed to being observed, to being seen. Not the stance of a governess, the stance of a lady, perhaps even one who had once danced in London's ballrooms. She turned suddenly, and saw him. For a moment, neither moved. Her eyes, green, flecked with gold near the iris, caught his breath mid-chest, the kind of gaze that disarmed even a man who believed himself impenetrable. Miss Winters, he said, his voice the cold armor he knew best. She rose instantly and curtsied. Your Grace, I didn't realize you were passing by, he interrupted, each word clipped to erase the warmth that threatened to surface. He looked at the children instead. Thomas straightened, solemn as ever. Sophie clutched the book to her chest. Silence filled the room. Alexander had never known what to say to his own children. The love he felt for them always seemed trapped behind a pane of glass, close enough to see, never close enough to touch. Miss Winters spoke first. The children are doing well, she said, her tone steady. Thomas has excellent handwriting, and Sophie, she glanced at the girl, eyes tender, is beginning to read on her own. He studied her closely. The dress was plain, yet the fabric, too fine for a governess. Her low bun had loosened, and a few rebellious strands framed her face. For an instant, a ghost stirred in his mind, Eleanor, with her loose curls and quiet laughter. The thought struck like a blade. He swallowed hard. Do you have previous experience as a governess? He asked, retreating behind formality. Victoria, Miss Winters, hesitated a fraction too long. Yes, she said finally. In Bath. With whom? A modest family, she replied. Their name? His voice sharpened. She blinked. I beg your pardon? The family's name, he repeated, expression unreadable. The silence scratched against the walls. The Hartwells, she said at last. Several years ago. Alexander nodded slowly. The name rang false, but he let it go, for now. Sophie, brave and bright, stepped forward and held out her book. "Papa, look! Miss Winters taught me this word." Alexander looked down at his daughter, and for a heartbeat, the world simply stopped. Sophie was her mother's mirror. The same curious eyes, the same smile he had feared never to see again. "That's very good," he murmured, his voice unsteady. The little girl smiled, shy, proud, and he knew he had to leave before that smile shattered what remained of his restraint. "Continue your lessons, Miss Winters," he said curtly, and left the room before she could reply. That night, he stood before the fire in his study, the amber light flickering across the decanter of brandy. The flames trembled like memories, faces, voices, laughter that no longer existed. Hartwell. There was no Hartwell family in Bath. He knew every name of consequence, every parcel of land, every contract, but the name didn't matter. It was what she had awakened. Sophie's laughter, Thomas's quiet attention. The sound of life seeping through the cracks he thought were sealed forever. Alexander pressed his hands to the desk, his face half buried in shadow. For 2 years he had lived among ghosts, his wife's, his house's, his own humanities. But now, something living, warm, inexplicably familiar, had entered his world and refused to leave. And he knew. From the moment he heard that laugh, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 3. The Mask Shatters. Victoria had discovered that living a lie was like breathing through a silk veil, invisible, suffocating, and constant. It wasn't the heavy, dramatic gestures that exhausted her. It was the small ones. The soft clink of porcelain when she set down her teacup. The automatic way she folded her napkin into the same perfect triangle she'd seen London ladies do 1,000 times. The instinct to keep her chin slightly lifted, even when no one was watching. Those tiny habits, carved into her like veins, betrayed her more than any confession could. And each time Sophie laughed, freely, loudly, carelessly, Victoria's heart softened. For just an instant she forgot she was Miss Clara Winters, the invisible governess of a house ruled by silence. But that afternoon, something changed. Mrs. Dawson, the strict, emotionless housekeeper, entered the schoolroom with a look Victoria had never seen on her face, hesitation. "Miss Winters," she said, wringing her hands against her apron. "His Grace requests your presence at dinner this evening." The room went utterly still. Victoria lifted her eyes from the history book she'd been reading with Thomas, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "The dinner," Mrs. Dawson repeated, visibly uneasy. "At 7 o'clock. He mentioned discussing the children's progress." Thomas raised his brows. Sophie covered her mouth, hiding a surprised giggle. But Victoria felt her stomach twist. Governesses did not dine with dukes. It was a boundary as rigid as the stone walls of the estate. Yet refusal might invite questions, and questions were far more dangerous than discomfort. "Of course," she said softly. "Please thank His Grace for the invitation." When the clock struck 7, Victoria descended the stairs with her pulse thudding like a drum beat. The corridor was hushed, save for the rain tapping gently against the stained glass windows. She wore her one decent gown, dark blue, high-necked, long-sleeved. Simple, but of a fabric far too fine for a governess. Fine enough to betray her. At the dining room door, she stopped, drew a deep breath. "You are Clara Winters," she told herself. Born in Bath, daughter of a housekeeper, educated enough to teach, modest enough to be unseen. She turned the handle, entered. The room was set for 2. Tall candles flickered, casting restless shadows over the silverware. The scent of roasted meat and red wine mingled with the warmth of the fire. And at the head of the table sat Alexander Hargrave, the Duke, tall, composed, the quiet strength of a man who carried an entire house on his shoulders. He rose as she entered, the gesture restrained but courteous. "Miss Winters," he said, his tone measured. "Thank you for joining me." Victoria curtsied and took her seat. That was when it happened. The mistake. Without realizing, she sat as a lady would, spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, ankles crossed beneath her chair, head held with effortless grace. It was too natural. Too perfect, Alexander noticed. His blue eyes narrowed slightly, assessing. Dinner began. Hot soup, fresh bread, tender roast. Victoria reached for the correct spoon, without hesitation, and brought it to her lips with the ease of habit. 3 spoonfuls in, she realized he wasn't eating. He was watching. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice calm, though her heart thundered. "Only curious," he said slowly. "Your manners are impeccable. For someone from Bath." Victoria froze. "My mother was a housekeeper in a noble home," she replied, forcing a small, controlled smile. She was strict. "Insisted I learn the basics." "It seems she taught you more than the basics," Alexander murmured, lifting his glass of wine. The crackle of the fire filled the silence that followed. Then he spoke again, eyes fixed on the crimson surface of his drink. "The children are different. More alive." Her chest warmed. "They are remarkable, Your Grace. They only needed to be seen." He looked up, the word lingering on his tongue. "Seen. Yes, Thomas is brilliant, and Sophie—" A smile slipped through. "Sophie believes the stars are fireflies trapped in a black sheet." For a second, something broke across his face. Not expression, but emotion. A flash of pain, there and gone. "Their mother used to say things like that," he said quietly. Victoria lowered her gaze. "Forgive me. I didn't know." "There's nothing to forgive?" His voice roughened. "You've done them good." She looked up and saw him. For the first time, truly saw him. Not the Duke, the man. The father buried beneath duty and loss. "And you, Your Grace?" she asked softly, before caution could stop her. "When was the last time someone asked how you are?" Alexander froze. The wineglass hovered mid-air. The air between them thickened. Heavy, alive. "I'm fine," he said finally. "Are you?" she pressed, holding his gaze. "Because this house, it doesn't feel like the home of someone who is fine. The curtains are always closed. The piano covered. Laughter kept behind walls. That isn't living, Your Grace. That's surviving." The silence fell like snow. He set the glass down sharply, jaw tightening. "You forget your place, Miss Winters." The color drained from her face. "Forgive me. I only—" "But you're not wrong." His voice cut through the tension. Quieter now, but raw. Alexander's eyes met hers with something unfamiliar. Recognition. "You're not like the others," he said slowly. Victoria tried to retreat, but her breath caught. "I only care about the children." "It's more than that," he murmured, leaning forward slightly. His gaze traced her face, not with desire, but with the hunger of a man trying to understand. "There's something—" The door opened. The butler appeared, silver tray in hand, a sealed envelope atop it. "My apologies for the interruption, Your Grace. Urgent correspondence from London." Alexander took the letter, broke the seal. As he read, the change in him was immediate. His face hardened. The air thickened. "Your Grace?" Victoria's voice trembled. He looked up slowly. "It's a notice from Lord Henry Lennox," he said, each word deliberate, searching for his missing sister. "Lady Victoria Lennox. Disappeared 3 weeks ago." His eyes met hers, sharp, unblinking. He requests that all noble households report any new hires. With manners too refined for their station, the world seemed to tilt. He slid the letter across the table. Brown hair, green eyes, 24, well-educated, the bearing of a lady. Victoria couldn't breathe. He stood. The light from the fire cast his shadow across her. "You speak French flawlessly. You hold yourself like nobility, and you dare look a duke in the eye without trembling." His voice was steel. "Tell me, Miss Winters, who are you?" Air left her lungs. The mask she'd fought so hard to wear finally broke. The tears came before the words. "My name?" she whispered, her voice fracturing. "Is Victoria. Victoria Lennox." And in that moment, the veil fell. The disguise, the title, the distance between them, all shattered under the gaze of the man who now knew who she truly was. And perhaps who she had been all along. Chapter 4. The Fire and the Truth. Alexander took a step back. Not out of fear, but because for the first time in 2 years, something stirred inside him besides emptiness, anger, confusion, and, disturbingly, curiosity. "Lady Victoria Lennox," he said slowly, tasting the name like something bitter and foreign. "Sister of Lord Henry Lennox. A fugitive. A liar." She said nothing. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, but she didn't lower her gaze. There was courage there, raw, trembling, but unmistakable. Not shame. Alexander turned toward the fire, his back to her. He needed to think. A lady, in his house, under his roof, living under a false name. He should have been furious. He should have sent her away at once, written to Lord Lennox and claimed the generous reward. But then he remembered. Sophie's laughter. Thomas's smile. The house breathing again. "Why did you run?" he asked without turning. Silence. Then her voice, small but steady. "My brother has debts. Enormous ones. He wanted to sell me to a man of 65 to pay them. I refused. So I ran." Alexander closed his eyes. He knew men like Lord Lennox. Knew exactly the kind of marriage she described. A legal prison wrapped in silk. He turned back to her. "You could have sought protection. Friends, distant relatives." "I have none," she whispered. "My mother died when I was 15. My father not long after. Henry inherited everything. And I had no choice, except to disappear." He studied her. The plain dress, the trembling hands, the posture that even now remained straight. "Pride, even on the edge of ruin. The children," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the air like glass. "Please, don't let them suffer because of me. I'll go, tomorrow, tonight if you wish. But find someone kind for them, someone who sees them." Alexander frowned. "You're concerned for them? Now?" "Always," she said softly. "Since the first day." Something shifted inside him. A part of himself he'd buried too deep to name. She could have begged for herself. Could have lied again. But she was pleading for them. He crossed the room to the table, picked up the letter, and read the description again. The name, the age, the promised reward. Then, without a word, he tossed it into the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the ink fading to ash. Victoria gasped. "Your Grace, your brother will not know you're here," he said, his tone firm but quiet. "And you will not leave." She blinked, stunned. "I don't understand." "My children need you," he said slowly, as if the words themselves resisted him. "And he stopped, swallowed hard. "I need them to live again. If you can make that happen, then I don't care who you are or where you came from." New tears welled in her eyes. But these were different, softer, disbelieving. "You trust me?" Alexander hesitated. "Do I? Not yet. Not fully." But there was something in her he recognized. Desperation, loneliness, the fierce will to protect what one loves. "I'm willing to try," he said finally. "But no more lies. Understood?" Victoria nodded, trembling. "No more lies." He inclined his head once. "And Lady Victoria," he added after a pause, "in this house you are still Miss Winters. To everyone. Including me." She smiled, small, fragile, but real. "Thank you." He turned away, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Because something dangerous was happening, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And he wasn't sure his heart was strong enough to bear it. Chapter 5. The moment the walls trembled. That night stretched endlessly for a woman who carried secrets in her chest. Victoria sat on the edge of the narrow bed, body still, mind collapsing in on itself. The candle before her burned in silence, its flame pulsing in time with her heartbeat. He knows. The thought pounded in her skull like a sentence carved in stone. And he didn't send me away. None of it made sense. Alexander Hargrave was not the kind of man to spare a liar. Not the kind who forgave. Dukes were creatures of precision, discipline, and control. Emotion was something they closed like an unpleasant book. And yet, that night, he had burned the circular about her, with his own hands. He had destroyed the very proof that could have freed him from her presence. And in doing so, he had chosen scandal over something she could not yet name. In the days that followed, silence itself became a presence between them, a living, breathing thing. He never mentioned the letter again, nor did he question her further. He simply watched. From a distance. From too near. As if she were a riddle he couldn't solve, but couldn't stop reading, and she felt it. The weight of his gaze. The pull of it every time they passed in the corridors. Every time the air thickened across the dinner table. Something had changed. There was a tension now, thin as a blade's edge, humming in every gesture. The way he touched his glass. The fraction of a pause before he looked away. The way her name sounded when he spoke it, softer, as if it no longer belonged to an employee, but to a thought. And she, despite her fear, could no longer pretend. She was no longer only Miss Winters, the quiet governess. She was a woman struggling to remain whole beneath the gaze of a man who, dangerously, had begun to truly see her. That afternoon, rain hammered the stained glass windows as Alexander entered the library. Victoria sat reading with the children. Thomas, serious and composed, reciting Shakespeare in his clear young voice. Sophie, beside her, sketching with her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The soft music of rain and childhood laughter blended into something rare. Peace. Until the door opened. Alexander stepped in, bringing with him the scent of wet earth and wind. His dark coat dripped onto the floor. His hair, disheveled and damp, clung to his forehead. The air seemed to shift, thicker, charged. "Papa!" Sophie cried, dropping her pencil and running toward him, and then the impossible happened. The man who had lived 2 years with his back to the world knelt. He knelt and let his daughter throw her arms around him. His hands came up, uncertain, hesitant, and then held her. Truly held her. The air in the room stilled. Victoria felt her throat tighten. So that was it. That was why he had let her stay. Not out of pity, but because of this. Because, somehow, she had brought laughter back into his house. Then Alexander lifted his eyes and found hers. What she saw in them made her step back, as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet. It wasn't gratitude. It was something far more dangerous. "Miss Winters has been teaching us about Hamlet," said Thomas, trying to sound grown. "She says he wasn't mad, only lost." Alexander rose slowly, still holding Sophie's small hand. "An interesting interpretation," he said. "It's the truth," Victoria answered before she could stop herself. "People call madness what they don't understand. Grief, sorrow, despair." Silence fell. Absolute. Electric. He watched her. Not with anger, but with the kind of attention that left nowhere to hide. And she realized too late that they were no longer speaking of Shakespeare. "You have strong opinions." "Miss Winters," he murmured, his voice low and sharp. "I apologize." "I shouldn't—" "No," he cut her off. "Don't apologize, it's refreshing." Then, without warning, he pulled out a chair and sat. Sophie blinked in surprise. Thomas stared. The Duke, the man of stone and silence, was sitting with them, as if he belonged. For the next hour they read together. Alexander corrected Thomas once, gently, patient for perhaps the first time in years. Sophie, bold as sunlight, climbed into his lap. He hesitated only a heartbeat before letting her stay. And when he began to read, his deep, resonant voice filled the room. Shakespeare came alive. No longer tragedy, but heartbeat, warmth, breath. Victoria watched, fingers knotted tightly in her lap, struggling to contain the wave inside her. He's not dead, she thought. He's only been asleep inside his grief. And maybe, just maybe, she was the echo that could wake him. When Mrs. Dawson arrived to take the children to supper, the room fell quiet again. Victoria gathered the books, pretending to focus. But Alexander didn't leave. He stood by the window, watching the rain trace long paths down the glass. "Thank you," he said suddenly. His voice was rough, sincere. "For what you do for them, for this." He gestured vaguely at the room, but she understood. "For bringing back laughter, for bringing back life." "There's no need to thank me," she said softly. "They've given me as much as I've given them." He turned. His gaze settled on her, heavy, unguarded, burning in a way that made her forget how to breathe. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between them. She could see the flicker of the fire in his eyes, the faint scar above his brow, the quiet exhaustion etched into every line of his face, and then something unexpected. "Victoria," he said, her real name. The sound of it on his tongue stopped her heart. "Yes?" She breathed. He took one step toward her, then stopped, trapped between duty and desire, between reason and the ache of being alive again. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Just, thank you." He left before she could answer. Victoria stood motionless. The silence of the library pressed in around her, warm and unbearable. The candle flickered, throwing restless shadows across the shelves. She leaned against the bookcase and closed her eyes. "Be careful," she told herself. You cannot fall in love with him, but her heart, foolish, willful thing, already knew the truth. It was far, far too late. Chapter 6. The Weight of Distance. For the next 3 days, Alexander avoided her. It wasn't difficult. All he had to do was retreat into the old habits that had kept him safe for years. Work late, take his meals in the study. Send messages through Mrs. Dawson when matters concerned the children. Stay away from the library. Stay away from her. Because that night in the library, when he had been 2 steps away from her, when her name had left his lips like a prayer, Alexander Hargrave had felt something he had sworn never to feel again. Desire, hope, life. 3 things that had died with Eleanor. And he had promised himself no one would ever reopen that hollow space inside him. It was safer this way. Simpler. But Victoria, Lady Victoria, he corrected himself, though the title now felt strangely wrong, was anything but simple. She was contradiction made flesh. Strong yet fragile, proud yet tender, cautious yet, at times, daring. And worst of all, she made the children laugh. She made the house breathe again. She made him feel. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he sat in his study, eyes fixed on a pile of contracts. The scratching of his pen filled the room until something cut through the stillness. Laughter. Light. Distant, impossibly alive. He froze, pushing away from the desk. He went to the window and saw Victoria and the children. Sophie in her arms, brown hair loose and wild in the wind. Thomas chasing them clumsily, his face split in an honest, wide smile. The grass still glistened from the morning rain, and Victoria, God help him, had taken off her shoes. She ran barefoot through the wet lawn, skirts gathered at her ankles, laughter echoing with the child's. The sight hit him like a blow. For a single, devastating moment, she looked like Eleanor, not in form, but in light, in the way she turned the ordinary into something alive. The ache rose sharp in his chest. I can't go through this again. He stepped back from the window, pulled the bell rope. The butler appeared almost instantly. Inform Miss Winters that her presence at dinner will no longer be required, Alexander said, eyes fixed on the fire. She is to focus solely on the children. Nothing more. The butler hesitated. Shall I also inform Mrs. Dawson, Your Grace? Yes. He waved a hand, impatient. Tell her Miss Winters is to remain in the children's wing. There's no need for further involvement elsewhere. That is all. Very good, Your Grace. When the door closed, Alexander expected relief, but all that came was emptiness. He returned to his desk, but the words on the contracts blurred before his eyes. Each letter dissolved into the memory of her laughter, the sound of sunlight breaking through years of winter. "Thank you," he had said to her. But what he had meant was, "Stay. Please stay." Yet letting someone in meant risking the pain of losing them. And he had lost enough. So he would rebuild the walls, distance, discipline, cold. It was the only way he knew how to survive. That night, he dined alone, as he always had. But the wine tasted like iron, and the silence like guilt. Even with Victoria still under his roof, the house felt again like a mausoleum. It was the right decision, he told himself, but a quieter voice, cruel and honest, and whispered back, "Coward." He was finishing his glass when hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. The door burst open without warning. Thomas. The boy stood there, breathless, eyes wide and wet. "Father, please. Sophie's calling for Miss Winters. She had a nightmare. She's crying, and Mrs. Dawson won't let her go upstairs. She said you ordered Miss Winters to stay in the nursery and not come without permission, but—" "Sophie keeps calling for her." Alexander was on his feet before the boy finished. His blood ran cold. Sophie. He took the stairs 3 at a time. In the children's room, Mrs. Dawson hovered helplessly beside the bed, while Sophie thrashed beneath the covers, sobbing. "Mama," she whimpered between gasps. "I want Mama." And there, standing in the doorway, was Victoria, pale, her hands clasped tightly before her, eyes locked on the child, waiting, obeying his order, or worse, what she believed was his command. Alexander looked at her, then at his daughter, and something in him finally broke. "Go," he said, voice rough. Victoria rushed forward. She knelt by the bed, gathered Sophie into her arms, whispering words so soft he could barely hear them. Slowly the child's sobs subsided. Her small fingers clung to Victoria's dress, and at last she drifted into sleep. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway. Thomas at his side, his small hand clutching his father's tightly. "This," Alexander thought, "this is what I've been missing since I decided not to feel." And for the first time in 2 long, hollow years, the Duke of Warrington understood that perhaps the real danger wasn't losing someone again, but continuing to live, without ever allowing himself to love. Chapter 7. The Choice. Victoria spent the night beside Sophie's bed, holding the little girl's warm hand, listening to her soft, even breathing. She didn't dare move, not after what had happened. Alexander had stood there for a long time, silent, unreadable, before leaving without a word. But his eyes had spoken for him. "Thank you. Forgive me. I don't know how to do this." When dawn painted the sky in shades of silver and rose, Mrs. Dawson appeared at the door. But her face wasn't merely serious, it was pale with fear. "Miss Winters." "The Duke requests your presence." "In the study." She hesitated. "There's a visitor." "From London." Victoria's blood turned to ice. No, it couldn't be. But she knew. Deep down, she had always known this moment would come. She kissed Sophie's forehead, smoothed her wrinkled dress, gathered her hair into a neat knot, and went downstairs. At the study door, she paused, took a breath, and entered. And there he was. Alexander stood by the fireplace, his face carved in stone. And across the room, examining the shelves with that same casual arrogance, was Henry, her brother. Impeccably dressed, golden hair slicked back, eyes pale and cruel as she remembered. He turned at the sound of her footsteps and smiled. That same sharp, hateful smile. "Victoria," he said, savoring her name. "At last. You were remarkably difficult to find." She said nothing, only lifted her chin. She would not tremble for him. Henry walked toward her, slow, deliberate, a predator circling prey, pretending to be a governess. "How charming," I always said you had a flair for drama. How did you find me? She asked quietly. Voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. His smile widened. Oh, my dear, you underestimate the value of gossip. He trailed a gloved finger along the spines of the books as he spoke. A lady's maid in Bath once mentioned a young governess with manners far too fine for her station. A stable boy swore he'd seen her board a coach heading north, paid with borrowed money. It wasn't difficult to follow the trail. Servants, drivers, a few well-placed letters. And when I heard the Duke of Warrington had hired a Miss Winters with perfect diction and the handwriting of a lady, he tilted his head mockingly. Well, the rest was easy. Money buys anything, even the location of runaway sisters who lie beautifully. The best lies, my dear, always leave a scent. The floor seemed to sway beneath her feet. Of course, the letters, the forged references, all of it had led him here. Henry turned toward Alexander, voice smooth and poisonous. I'm grateful, Your Grace, for sheltering my sister, but I'll be taking her back to London, where she belongs. No! Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm not going, Henry laughed. Don't be ridiculous. You have no choice. You're my responsibility, my ward, and you will marry Bancroft, as you should have done 2 months ago. She said no. Alexander's voice sliced through the air. He had moved, now standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the quiet power in his presence. Protection. And in this house, Lord Lennox, he said evenly, a lady's word is respected. Henry's expression darkened. With all due respect, Your Grace, this is none of your concern. Victoria is my sister, my legal responsibility until she is married. And as she clearly isn't, she is under my protection, Alexander interrupted, his voice calm but deadly. And while she is, no one will force her into anything. Not even you. Henry's face reddened with fury. You can't do that. She's a fugitive. She abandoned her duty. She has debts to pay. Debts you created, Victoria said, anger trembling through her words. With your gambling, with your lies, you squandered everything our parents left us. And now you want to sell me like livestock to pay for your shame? Watch your tone, Henry hissed. No, Alexander said, stepping forward until he stood between them. You watch yours. His voice dropped lower, colder. You're in my house, Lord Lennox, under my roof, and here she has a choice. He turned slightly, his gaze finding hers over his shoulder. So, Victoria, the choice is yours. You may leave with him if that's what you wish. Or you may stay, here, as part of this family. No obligations, no chains, just freedom. Silence. Victoria looked at Henry, red-faced, fists clenched, powerless, then at Alexander. And what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Respect, kindness, trust. I'll stay, she said clearly. I choose to stay. Henry's composure shattered. This is absurd. She cannot simply... She can, Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. And she will. I suggest you leave, Lord Lennox, now, before I forget my manners and remove you myself. Henry glared at them both. There was hatred in his eyes, but also fear. Because he knew he held no power here. Not against a duke. He straightened his coat, sneering. You'll regret this, Victoria. When the money runs out, when the novelty fades, you'll beg to come back. She smiled faintly. Sad. Resolute. I won't. Because for the first time, Henry, I'm exactly where I belong. He left, slamming the door so hard it echoed through the house like thunder. Silence. Victoria's knees buckled. But before she could fall, Alexander caught her. Steady. Gentle. It's all right, he murmured. It's over. He's gone. She turned in his arms, tears glistening, not of fear, but of relief. Why? She whispered. Why did you do that for me? He lifted a hand, brushing her cheek with reverence, as if afraid she might disappear. Because you matter, he said softly. To me, to the children, To this home. He drew a slow breath. And because I'm tired of living in fear. Of pretending not to feel. You taught me how to live again, Victoria? How could I ever let you go? She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against his. Thank you, she whispered. For letting me choose. Always, he said. You will always have a choice here. And in that moment, Victoria knew. It didn't matter what storms would come. It didn't matter what society whispered, what scandals waited, what doors might close. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. She was choosing, and she chose to stay. Chapter 8. The light after the storm, the days after Henry's departure felt like the silence that follows a storm. Not peace exactly, but a fragile stillness that Victoria feared to disturb. Each morning she woke half expecting the sound of carriage wheels in the courtyard, imagining Henry returning, furious, demanding she pay for her defiance. But he didn't come. And little by little she began to believe the impossible. She was free. Free to walk through the house without fear. Free to laugh with the children. Free to exist without hiding. Alexander had changed too. He never mentioned the confrontation again. He simply continued but differently. He dined with them most evenings now. Sometimes he read in the library while she sat by the fire, sewing in silence. They didn't speak much, yet their silences were no longer empty. They were warm, comfortable. At times his eyes would lift from the page, find hers across the room. And he would smile. Small, fleeting, but real. 3 weeks passed. One soft afternoon, Alexander found her in the garden. Victoria knelt in the soil, skirts lifted to her knees, teaching Sophie how to plant seeds. Thomas stood nearby, trying to appear serious, though amusement sparkled behind his eyes. They were laughing about something small, something only children would find funny. And for a moment, the world felt simple. Victoria's hair had escaped its pins, sunlight catching the loose golden strands. Her hands were dirty, her cheeks flushed. She looked so alive, so much a part of this place that Alexander simply stopped and watched. This was his family, not by blood, but by choice. And there, among the scent of damp earth and laughter, Alexander Hargrave understood what he had to do. That night, he asked Victoria to come to his study. She entered hesitantly, carrying the faint scent of lavender and soil, her hair loosely gathered, her eyes questioning. Has something happened? She asked softly. Sit down, he said. She obeyed, hands folded in her lap. Alexander remained standing, visibly uneasy. A rare thing for a man who had always seemed carved from control itself. Victoria, he began slowly, I need to ask you something. And I want you to answer honestly, she nodded. I always do. Are you happy here? He asked without preamble. Truly happy? Or merely safe? She blinked, startled by the question. I am happy, she said, her voice trembling. More than I've ever been. The children, this house, you... She blushed, lowering her gaze. All of this makes me happy. He took a step toward her. Then another. Stopped in front of her chair. And if I offered you something more? He asked. Not just safety. Not just shelter, but a name, a place. A real family, she rose, heart-pounding. Alexander, what are you saying? He reached for her hands, still rough from the garden, trembling and beautiful. I'm saying that I love you. Victoria froze. He went on, voice rough, honest, stripped of armor. I love your strength, your gentleness. The way you brought laughter back to this house. I love the way Thomas looks at you. The way Sophie falls asleep in your arms. I even love the dirt on your hands, because it reminds me that life can grow again. And I cannot imagine my days without you anymore. So, he drew a shaky breath. Marry me. Not out of convenience. Not out of pity. But because I love you. And I want you to stay. Forever. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could speak. Alexander, I'm not worthy of... Don't, he interrupted, firm but tender. Don't ever say that again. You are the most worthy soul ever to walk through these doors. It would be an honor to have you as my wife. She laughed through her tears. How could I refuse, when everything I've ever wanted is right here? She touched his face, her fingers trembling. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I'll marry you. He drew her into his arms, and the kiss that followed wasn't of passion alone. It was promise. It was home. Two broken hearts finally finding the rhythm they had lost. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered. For teaching me how to live again, she smiled softly. And thank you for teaching me that home isn't a place. It's where we are chosen. 2 weeks later, in the small chapel on the estate, Victoria Lennox became Victoria Hargrave, Duchess of Warrington. Sophie scattered rose petals down the aisle, radiant with joy. Thomas held the rings with solemn pride, and when the vicar asked if there was any objection, silence filled the chapel, perfect and complete, because there was none. Only two people who had finally found their way back to the light. That evening, as they sat at dinner, Alexander at her right, Thomas at her left, Sophie curled in her lap, Victoria looked around the table. The curtains were open, letting the moonlight spill across the room. Candles flickered, faces glowed, laughter filled the air, and when Sophie murmured sleepily, "Good night, Mama," before being carried to bed, Victoria felt her heart overflow. This, she thought. This is happiness. Alexander reached beneath the table and found her hand. Squeezed gently, she looked at him, her husband, her love, her home, and knew. Every lie, every tear, every desperate escape had led her here, to this table. This family, this golden light that wrapped everything like a blessing. Victoria Hargrave smiled, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next, she would never be alone again. Epilogue: Where We Stop Running. 6 months later, winter melted into a soft drizzle over the fields of Warrington. Victoria stood by the window on the second floor, the very same window where, months ago, she had first seen little Sophie crying alone in the garden. Now, that same child was laughing, running barefoot through the wet grass, her white dress splattered with mud. Below, Alexander and Thomas worked side by side, planting something the boy had chosen himself. The rain fell gently over the young leaves, and the air smelled of earth and renewal. Victoria pressed her forehead to the cool glass. The sound of the rain no longer carried sorrow, only peace. Arms slipped around her waist from behind. Alexander. The warmth of him anchored her to the moment. He rested his chin on her shoulder, eyes following the scene outside. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice blending with the rhythm of the rain. "The day I arrived," she said softly. "At this very window. Everything seemed so dead." He drew a quiet breath. "It was dead," he said simply. "I was dead. Until you." She turned in his arms, her fingers brushing his face. There was no trace of darkness there anymore. Only warmth, only love. "We saved each other," she whispered. Alexander smiled, that quiet, grounding smile that always disarmed her. "I think we did." That evening, they gathered in the music room. The piano, once locked away beneath dust and memories, now stood open, surrounded by the soft glow of candles like tiny constellations. Victoria played. The notes were hesitant at first, fragile, but soon they deepened, alive, breathing, filled with soul. Sophie hummed along, off-key and delighted. Thomas sat beside her, turning the pages of the score with exaggerated seriousness. Though his eyes gleamed with joy, Alexander watched them, his wife, his children, his home, and thought, how did I ever live without this? Victoria looked up from the piano. Their eyes met. One glance, one heartbeat, and in it lived every word they didn't need to say. "Thank you. I love you too. We're home." The music went on. The air shimmered. Candlelight flickered gold against the walls. Outside, rain tapped softly at the windows. But inside, there was only light, warmth, life. Sophie fell asleep in Alexander's arms, her small head resting against his chest. Thomas leaned into Victoria, still holding her hand. Across the space between them, husband and wife shared a look. Tender, quiet, eternal. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because they both knew. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin at grand balls or beneath crystal chandeliers. They begin in escape, in necessary lies, in broken hearts learning, slowly, how to beat again. And sometimes, home isn't where we're born. It's where we finally stop running,